And welcome to the special edition of Hannity. Behind the Bias, a close-up look at the Obama mania media's liberal bias. Now, it's common knowledge that the mainstream media, from the major television networks to the country's most influential newspapers, are biased against the GOP. Tonight, we'll examine some of the major scandals that resulted from this bias and the victims that it has left in its wake. But first, how and why this bias began.
I felt this thrill going up my leg. I mean, I don't have that too often.
Largely as a result of the policies and priorities of the Reagan administration, more people are becoming poor and staying poor in this country than at any time since World War II.
It is liberalism, whether people like it or not, which has animated all the years of my life. What on earth did conservatism ever accomplish for our country?
Republicans may have learned to live with media bias and even to fight against it, but to many, the roots of this bias remains a mystery. The media's hostility towards the GOP first emerged as a bizarre tendency to apologize for America's enemies.
Under the communists, women in the workplace were glorified.
And as Republicans gained power, the media turned its sights on them, portraying the GOP's most influential figures as either evil or stupid. This bias goes all the way back to the 1930s when New York Times reporter Walter Duranty traveled to Stalin's Soviet Union. Now, during the Ukrainian famine that killed millions, he told his readers that, quote, any report of a famine in Russia is today an exaggeration or malignant propaganda. In a socialist utopia like the Soviet Union, Duranty argued, quote, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs.
The New York Times sends a reporter over there who comes back and says he's seen the future, and it works.
To have a fundamentally conflicted attitude about not just the United States, but whether the United States is a constructive force in the world, that is something that I think really does separate a lot of liberals and conservatives.
The media have been apologizing for America's enemies from the Cold War through the War on Terror.
Many Soviets, viewing the current chaos and nationalist unrest under Gorbachev, look back almost longingly to the era of brutal order under Stalin.
Communism is being swept away, but so too is the social safety net it provided.
For Castro, freedom starts with education. And if literacy alone were the yardstick, Cuba would rank as one of the freest nations on earth.
There was an element of the left, particularly in the news media, that saw the Soviet Union as a wonderful experiment. They were just simply blind to the tens of millions who were massacred.
They tend to think of the United States as having had influences on the world that are at times quite destructive. And so I think, for example, they found it easy, liberal journalists, to develop a posture whereby they weren't American journalists. Their job was to be neutral, not just about any given story they were covering, but even about the United States.
This left-wing bias emerged in the mid-20th century when liberals dominated most of American intellectual and public life. That dominance shaped the media's portrayal of the GOP.
That long liberal dominance over intellectual life, over government life, over legislative majorities in Congress, that bred a complacency and a self-righteousness that I think really affected media coverage, including especially of the conservatives in their rising years, and is still with us today.
This liberal dominance also affected the media's attitude towards conservative policies and ideas.
Liberalism is treated as the natural default. It's conservatism that needs to be explained. It's conservatism that needs narratives.
Ironically, it was the emergence of a muscular conservative movement in the mid-1950s, led by William F. Buckley and his National Review magazine, that bred hostility towards conservatives on the part of the mainstream media.
Will you welcome William Buckley?
It was very threatening for them when conservative voices began to rise in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, challenging their interpretations of a great number of things.
The ability to puncture a lot of liberal myths is in the court of Bill Buckley and later people like Irving Kristol, that people were coming along and saying, hey, wait a second, there isn't just one way of thinking in America.
Their rising confidence and the reach of their voices did provoke a backlash.
That backlash led to a simplistic portrayal of conservatives in the media. Many are depicted as evil. From Ronald Reagan.
The Reagan years oppressed me because of the callousness and the greed and the hard-hearted attitude toward people who have very little in this society.
To Dick Cheney.
He has become a dark figure.
And of course, Karl Rove.
He probably set up bin Laden for this thing.
They will not allow that conservatives might be wrong, but are driven by noble intentions. They won't even allow that. Conservatives have to be described as being wrong and being evil at the same time.
There is a self-righteous streak that runs through a great deal of liberal and progressive policymaking from the New Deal through the 1960s and 1970s, in which they were convinced that they really had the solutions to problems, in which case if you disagreed with them, you probably didn't want to solve that problem, if for some reason you were uncaring.
And if conservatives aren't evil and heartless, well, then they're just stupid.
When I listen to the Republicans in Congress on foreign policy, there's such an I'm stupid and proud of it attitude.
Good morning. The Gipper was an airhead.
Sarah Palin makes Barack Obama look like John Adams. I mean, it's no contest.
The New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, CBS, NBC, ABC, run by the Ivy Leaguers and that liberal elite, they get certification from those schools, right? So guess what? When they're talking to Al Gore, when they're talking to Barack Obama, the assumption is you're one of us. You're no dummy. You're a smart guy. And then they start talking about everything that goes, let's say, with a George Bush who went to Harvard Business School and Yale undergrad. But again, the assumption is, you know what? You really got in there because of your parents. You don't really belong. You're not one of us.
They see themselves as enlightened, they see themselves as intelligent, and they see themselves as good, and therefore conservatives are the opposite.
The story, time and again, is Republicans don't know what they're talking about. They're ill-informed, i.e., they're dummies. They're a bunch of stupid people, and they're a bunch of ignoramuses who react on the basis of emotion, say the most outrageous and provocative things, but really don't know what they're talking about. And oh, gee whiz, Democrats come out of the top schools in the country. They're all the Ivy Leaguers. They're the ones who really are bookish and geekish, and they may not exactly get it right, but they're really the smart ones.
And welcome back to the special edition of Hannity. Now, the New York Times is often called the paper of record, but we've uncovered that, well, it's not living up to its reputation.
The New York Times has a long-held slogan of all the news that's fit to print, but I think that astute readers over the years understand that their operational motto is all the news that's fit to distort, all the news that's fit to suppress, and all the news that's fit to ignore.
As the New York Times, long revered as the gold standard in print journalism, lost its lofty position as a result of bias.
I'm a centrist Democrat, and I have always believed that the New York Times is the paper of record. That being said, I now see that the New York Times has become a newspaper with a point of view, and that point of view is on the left.
It's the story that consults an expert, and the expert is at a left-leaning think tank. It's the story that consults an expert, and the expert is a left-leaning professor somewhere. It's those kind of things that make the news stories lean just a bit to the left.
Some say the shift can be traced back 10 years to when Hal Raines went from being the left-leaning editorial page editor to executive editor of the paper itself. Now, Raines, who admitted in his memoir to always voting as a liberal, wrote that the religious climate of the late 90s was, quote, mutating into the new redneck church militant that would, in a few months, deliver us into the land of W, where the monkey trial gives way to the monkey grin. In 2003, Raines resigned in the wake of the Jason Blair scandal just 2 years into his post as executive editor. As many remember, Jason Blair was fired from the Times for making up facts and stories.
I'm truly sorry for my actions and what they've done.
William McGowan is a columnist who first began examining journalistic bias in his book called Coloring the News. His latest book, Gray Lady Down, looks at the New York Times.
I thought it was important to look at what was going on inside America's premier news organization. And it was frightening. The blunders, the biased coverage, the gaffes are kind of chilling.
Now, there are several major news stories that illustrate the pervasive liberal bias at the New York Times. One of the most glaring examples involves the 3 Duke lacrosse players who in 2006 were falsely accused of rape by an exotic dancer. Now, the New York Times was quick to jump on the story, but not on the facts.
They smeared those players, they jumped to conclusions.
Articles and op-eds were written titled, "When Peer Pressure, Not a Conscience, is Your Guide. A Team's Troubles Shock Few at Duke, and When Boys Go Wild."
They fell into the role of assassinating the character of the Duke lacrosse students and somehow cloaking this dancer in the mantle of victimhood.
Charges were dropped against the men in April of the following year when it was revealed that the accuser had made up the entire story.
There were many points in this case where caution would have served justice better than bravado.
But their reputations were already tarnished.
It's been 395 days since this nightmare began.
These guys had their lives upended for a year or more, and there was no post-mortem where they should have tasked a couple of reporters to say, Duke rape case, how we messed up.
More recently, the Times coverage of the Tea Party protests across the country has been called into question.
They have failed to acknowledge that the Tea Party is a large, legitimate, grassroots organization. Having written a book about the Tea Party, I know that the Tea Party I wrote about is a very different Tea Party than the one the New York Times has described.
What we had was an almost coordinated effort by every single columnist on the New York Times op-ed page to take any last act of random violence or random discord and blame it on the Tea Party.
This same liberal slant was noticeable last year when Arizona passed its strict anti-illegal immigration law.
When that law passed, you really would have thought it was something akin to Hitler's Nuremberg laws.
And when Arizona Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot by a deranged man earlier this year, the New York Times rushed to judgment once again. Within hours of the tragic shooting, Paul Krugman wrote on his blog, quote, "We don't have proof yet that this was political, but the odds are that it was. She's been the target of violence before. Her father says that the whole Tea Party was her enemy. And yes, she was on Sarah Palin's infamous crosshairs list."
In 2007, Bill Keller, who was the editor, insisted that the paper had no political or ideological agenda, that they simply reported the facts. But that wasn't the case in the aftermath of the Tucson massacre, certainly when you had the likes of Paul Krugman, Frank Rich, every hired and paid New York Times columnist trying to link those acts of violence that were committed by a single lone deranged individual and using it to try and undermine the free speech of conservatives. Their explicit, overt agenda was to try and chill conservative thought and criminalize conservative speech.
The New York Times lost its journalistic mind. It went from being an unquestioned left-of-center newspaper to a radical left-wing newspaper, and it might as well be produced by the Obama administration.
And welcome back to Behind the Bias, a history of liberal media. Now, the mainstream media holds conservatives to different standards than their liberal colleagues. But what are these standards, and how does this hypocrisy affect American politics?
There is so much left-wing bias in the mainstream media that if you give them a sword, they will use it, and they will relish using it. If a Democrat gives them a sword, more often than not, they will lay it down.
As a result of their bias, the liberal media imposes outrageous double standards on the GOP. From racial issues to matters of intellect, Republicans are routinely held to a much higher standard than their Democratic counterparts.
They are always willing to forgive Democrats and liberals or ignore the sins of Democrats and liberals, but will never forgive conservatives for what they say.
Now, this double standard is clearly evident when it comes to racial issues. Senate Minority Leader Trent Lott was forced to resign his leadership position back in 2002 when at a birthday party for former Senator Strom Thurmond, he said,
"When Strom Thurmond ran for president, we voted for him. We're proud of it."
That was seen as a tacit endorsement of the kind of segregation that Thurmond stood for at the time. And for many people, those kinds of gaffes or statements or slips of the tongue, those are seen as revealing something. It fits very easily into a narrative that conservative politics in America rose on the back of racial prejudice.
But for liberals, it's a different story. The media was silent when then-Senator Joe Biden referred to Barack Obama as the first mainstream African-American candidate who is articulate and bright and clean, or told an Indian-American supporter this.
You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent. I'm not joking.
When liberals make verbal slips of those kinds, and we have ones from Joe Biden and many other political figures, it doesn't fit a narrative of any particular kind. Therefore, the story is usually reported, but it's not fit into a larger narrative, and it isn't remembered 5 or 10 years later.
Anybody with any smarts who's paying attention says, you know what, this process lacks integrity. It's not equal, it's not balanced. You're not really concerned about race and about intimidation and offense. What you're concerned with is scoring political points.
The roots of this hypocrisy go all the way back to the Civil Rights Movement and the Democratic Party's shameful past.
The Democratic Party has a lot to apologize for when it comes to race. Robert Byrd, when he was alive, had a lot to apologize with regards to race. Al Gore Sr., who opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Sam Ervin, the hero of Watergate. These were all deep-dyed segregationists. And so if you dig very deep into Democratic dirt, you'll be turning over just a treasure chest of old racist comments and attitudes.
And the liberal media has allowed the Democrats to bury this history.
Along about the time that the media went left, they began to assist the Democratic Party in the airbrushing of their racist past out of the headlines. Someone had to be the bad guy in the Civil Rights War. Someone had to take the fall for having had a segregationist South. And with a less than brilliant media, they don't understand the history of the Civil Rights Act.
But perhaps no media double standard is as outrageous as the one surrounding intelligence and stupidity. Dan Quayle was nearly laughed out of office when he misspelled the word potato at a Trenton middle school.
Add one little bit on the end. Potato. You're right, phonetically. There you go. All right.
And vice presidential nominee and Fox News contributor Sarah Palin was mocked relentlessly after her interview with CBS News anchor Katie Couric.
What newspapers and magazines did you regularly read before you were tapped for this?
All of them, any of them.
The default position for the liberal media vis-a-vis conservatives is that conservatives are dumb. So that when a Dan Quayle makes a faux pas, they jump on it because, aha, see, I told you he was dumb. When a liberal makes the same kind of faux pas, the media's reaction is completely the opposite. They see these people as uber enlightened, and therefore it was just a faux pas, and therefore it doesn't merit coverage, and so they ignore it.
And ignore it they have, from Al Gore's infamous inquiry at Monticello.
Who are these people? Well, this is George Washington on the extreme right and Benjamin Franklin on the left.
To the president and vice president's greatest hits.
Chuck Graham, state senator's here. Chuck, stand up, Chuck. Let him see you. Oh, God love you. What am I talking about?
I've now been in 57 states. I think one left to go.
When the stock market crashed, Franklin Roosevelt got on television and didn't just talk about the princes of greed. He said, look, here's what happened.
Unfortunately for Biden, FDR was not the president when the stock market crashed. Herbert Hoover was. And television, well, that had not yet been invented.
Someone like Barack Obama can make a variety of factual slips about running his campaign in 57 states or other things without anyone impugning his intelligence. Those are treated as what they are. They're slips of the tongue. But they're not fitted into a narrative that somehow Barack Obama is unintelligent.
With the Democrats, it's a smile, it's a nod, and let's move on. And everybody knows that Joe Biden's the smartest guy who ever came out of Delaware.
Now, the double standards imposed by the media shape the news, and as Americans turn on the television day after day, they also shape the nation's political narrative.
The assumption is Republicans don't know what they're talking about, don't understand because they haven't taken the time to study the issue. Democrats know so much about this issue, are so well schooled, are so erudite, and have the experience to deal with this issue, but most people just can't keep up with them.
Once they've defined someone as either outside the mainstream, a lunatic, or stupid, the circuit breaker throws the minute you see them on television. The ability to persuade is over, and that's really the most damaging thing to a democratic republic, is the inability to hear people who you're programmed to disregard.
Now, given this ingrained bias, how are conservatives still winning elections?
The American voter is beginning to develop a sense of sophistication, that they are no longer so easily manipulable by media narrative that they used to be.
So it just may be that the American people are too smart to fall for the myths perpetuated by the liberal media.
Facts are stubborn things, to use that old cliche, and the facts will out eventually. We still win anyway, conservatives do, because we've got facts and truth on our